What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. What has happened in Armenia less than a month ago is not just another parliamentary election in a small post-Soviet country. Because for anti-war Russians, Armenia has become a refuge, a place where Russian families, journalists, mobilization avoiders, and people who do not simply want to live under Putin's rules, all of them have tried to rebuild their lives in Armenia. Which is why this past election suddenly matters far beyond Yerevan itself. If you think about it, the election looks very similar to the Moldovan general election of 2025, because the central issue is not taxation, welfare or migration, but the bigger question, or where the country is going to belong politically. Whether Armenia continues moving towards European integration under civil contract and Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's, or whether it gets pulled back into Moscow's orbit through Strong Armenia, created and led by billionaire Samvel Karapetyan, the owner of Tashir Group. And this is where the story becomes almost too obvious, because Karapetyan is a Russian oligarch with the empire that includes once again Tashir portfolio, Rio chain of retail and entertainment centers, restaurant chains, movie theater chains, residential real estate, and Fora-Bank in Russia, which ranks 62nd by total assets and 35th by customer deposits, while Forbes places Tashir second on its real estate kings of Russia's list, with a total annual rental income of $640 million. So let's call this what it is. Armenia's ruling party is not simply running against an opposition party, it is running against a Russian-backed political project wrapped in Armenian packaging. And the real question today is why Putin keeps doing the same thing again and again, why he tries to intervene, and even when almost every foreign election he touched before pushes that country further away from Russia. And why, when things do not go his way, suddenly every country becomes a potential target for invasion to restore the order. Guys, while preparing for this particular video and reading through the articles, I encountered something extremely odd. So I have a question for you personally. Have you ever noticed how a single word in a headline can completely change the story you're about to read? Take this one, for example, involving Russian politician Boris Nadezhdin. One headline simply says, Russian anti-war politician Nadezhdin arrested. That's it, simple as that. It's straightforward, it tells you what happened, who it happened to, and lets you decide for yourself what to do with this information, what it means. But then you scroll down a little bit and another outlet covers exactly the very same event with this headline. Russia arrests opposition president Boris Nadezhdin, Putin's last great internal rival. Now the focus shifts completely. The story is no longer just about an arrest, it is about a much bigger conclusion, that Nadezhdin was Putin's last great internal rival, that Putin has absolutely no challengers left and he will rule forever. Well, that's a very powerful characterization, and before you even clicked on the article, it already makes you assume totally wrong things. Same instance, same day, but one headline reports the news, the event, the other just simply invokes emotions. This is exactly why I use ground news. Instead of seeing just one headline chosen by an algorithm, you can compare headlines side by side and instantly notice how different outlets frame the very same story. Some stick to describing the event itself, others add interpretation or broader context right in the headline. Ground news also shows you how many sources are covering the same story and where those publications fall across the political spectrum, helping you understand not only what is being reported, but how different media organizations present it. Because sometimes the biggest difference is not the facts. It is the story the headline wants you to believe before you have even read the very first paragraph. Ground News also does AI summaries, so you can see what left, center and right-wing media are mostly talking about. Very useful service in 2026 and, well, I'm sure many of you can agree on that. So guys, if you want 40% off the Vantage plan, please go ahead and scan this QR code or go to ground.news/Russian and please subscribe. Helps our channel tremendously. Don't just read the news, see how the news is being framed. Thanks so much Ground News for sponsoring this video. Now back to the program. Here's where it gets interesting, because Samvel Karapetyan's campaign had almost every feature you would expect from a Russian-affiliated political operation. Only updated for the modern internet age, of course, where old 1990s style hardball tactics are mixed with social media misinformation, voter pressure, business networks, and the quiet assumption that money can buy everything and can even replace trust. Karapetyan was supposed to look like the serious alternative, the strong manager who understands money, business stability, while Pashinyan could be presented as chaotic, a little bit too pro-European, and too risky for Armenia's relationship with Russia. But the more Moscow touched this campaign, the harder it became for voters not to notice what it is really being offered. Strong Armenia may have an Armenian name, that's the political party of Karapetyan once again, and Karapetyan may even carry Armenian citizenship, but the story surrounding him is filled with Russian assets, Russian elite networks, Russian talking points, and the familiar Kremlin idea that a country is only stable for as long as when its voters accept the leader preferred and instated by Moscow. Meanwhile, severe contract Pashinyan's party has been moving in the completely opposite direction, with Pashinyan campaigning on European integration, while the European Union has openly even supported that direction and announced a package to compensate Armenia for import bans and trade restrictions imposed by nobody else but by Moscow. Which means that neither side is pretending this is only about local politics anymore. Russia and Europe are both invested, but the difference is in the method. Because Brussels is offering support to soften the pressure, while Moscow is trying to make pressure the message itself. And that is why this election looks less like a campaign and more like a referendum on whether Armenia can make decisions without being punished by its formal imperial center. And to understand why Putin is making such a reckless bet, we need to look beyond Armenia. Because this is not the first time the Kremlin has tried to engineer politics outside of its own borders. Surprise, surprise. And the results have almost always followed the very same pattern. Now here is where most people look at Russian interference as some brilliant chess game, when in reality, if you look at the last 20 years plus, it looks much more like a man walking into the same wall again and again, and then blaming that this wall is being controlled by the West, even though it just, stands there. Ukraine is the obvious example, the most recent one, because Putin spent years trying to keep Kyiv inside Moscow's orbit, including when he acted as an international confidant for Viktor Yanukovych, that president in the past, of course, openly backing him in Ukrainian politics, and the long result was not loyal Ukraine as a result of all this, but billions upon billions of dollars spent, relations destroyed, and a country that became more anti-Kremlin with every new attempt to dominate it. Obviously. Then came Moldova, where Putin's circle tried more than once to weaken Maya Sandu. Montenegro then, where Russian involvement also became an embarrassing political adventure. And even the more recent example of J.D. Vance endorsing Viktor Orban in Hungary, where the opposition defeated both Orban and Fidesz in a blowout at the polls. Because nobody enjoys feeling like an outside power is choosing their government for them. The strange part is that the Kremlin should understand this better than anyone, because even inside Russia, where the state has spent 26 years narrowing the political field, controlling the media, pressuring the internet, and developing every administrative trick, elections still make the system nervous. During Putin's 26-year rule, no Kremlin candidate has ever won the round of gubernatorial election, even though the people allowed into these ballots are usually harmless figures who barely try. And still, the authorities had to invent electronic voting, fight strategies like smart voting, and increasingly replace campaigning with administrative control. That is why the Armenian case is so strange, because the same people who fear genuine elections at home somehow imagine they can win competitive elections abroad, in a country where they cannot even remove Pashinyan from a ballot, fully control the media, jail every competitor, or simply rewrite the result through the tools they rely on inside Russia. This is basically an unjustified obsession with American power, because Kremlin officials have spent years convincing themselves that Americans secretly control every single election everywhere. And instead of learning that this worldview is wrong, they try to imitate what they imagine Washington is doing, only much louder, rougher, with way more mistakes, and with far less understanding of local society. But in Armenia, this habit becomes even more dangerous, because Russia did not just try to influence the campaign with media and money. It began using trade, energy, customs, and even the language of military intimidation as political tools. And that is exactly where the election became a test of sovereignty. This is where things take a fascinating turn, because several weeks before the election, Russia began weaponizing trade against Armenia in a way that was impossible to separate from the campaign itself, restricting agricultural exports and creating the impression that Armenian voters were being told to choose the right government or pay the consequences, pay the price. Russian retailers were blocked from importing Armenian flowers, mineral water, fish, vegetables and fruits, and Moscow also restricted the transport of those very same goods through Russia to other so-called friendly states, like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, things like this, which means that this was not a normal trade dispute, but a pressure mechanism aimed directly at Armenia's economy. Putin also threatened to expel Armenia from the Eurasian Economic Union, raise energy export tariffs and tax duties, and tighten customs clearance procedures. And then the language became even darker, with repeated references to the Ukrainian scenario, meaning Moscow was signaling not only economic punishment, but the possibility of a much harsher confrontation if Armenia continued to push on Pashinyan's path, including the possibility for, well, you already guessed it, the invasion. Now imagine how that sounds to an Armenian voter, because the message is basically this: keep the government that wants Europe, and your exports, borders, economy, national security can all become way more difficult. Or choose people more comfortable for Moscow, and maybe everything becomes easier once again, just maybe. That kind of pressure may sound powerful in the mind of a Kremlin strategist, but for a normal person, for normal people, it often has the completely opposite effect, because voters do not usually enjoy being threatened right before their vote, and every new restriction becomes one more reminder that the relationship Moscow is offering is completely no ways a friendship, but a dependency. The Reuters report that Russia planned to send 100,000 ethnic Armenians residing in Russia to vote in the Armenian election only made the whole story look even more absurd, because 100,000 people is roughly the population of Gyumri city. And even if the logistics are unclear, the fact that such an idea could be discussed at higher levels tells you something more about the way just Moscow thinks. And this is where the logic becomes self-defeating, because polls are already suggesting that Pashinyan's party was on track for a landslide victory, even if we do not know exactly how Armenian polling accounts for rural Armenia, where approximately 37% or a little bit more than a third of the entire population lives. So Putin appears to be pushing hard against the likely frontrunner, while almost guaranteeing a worse relationship with the same person after the election. To understand why Moscow would even poison a relationship with a leader it may have to deal with for years, we need to look at the person Putin is really reacting to, because Nikol Pashinyan is not just another post-Soviet prime minister in Putin's eyes. He represents something much more threatening for the regime of Putin. Here's the part that personally shocked me the most, because the explanation for intervention may not be a sophisticated 5-year plan or some deep strategic calculation, but something much simpler and way more personal. Putin seems to genuinely resent Nikol Pashinyan and everything his rise to power represents. Pashinyan came to power through the 2018 Velvet Revolution, when peaceful street protests led to the exile of the archaic government in a post-Soviet country. And for Putin, this is almost a nightmare scenario, because it proves, first of all, that the population can and should organize, apply pressure, and change the leadership without the permission from the man at the very top. That is exactly the example Putin cannot allow to look successful, because if a revolution in a neighboring country leads not to collapse and humiliation, but to European integration, visa-free travel prospects, stronger independence, and economic growth, then the entire Kremlin story about street protests begins to break down completely. We saw the very same instinct after Euromaidan, because Putin needed Ukrainians and Russians to see a successful protest not as a path to dignity, but as a path to Crimea, Donbass, confrontation, and national trauma. So when he looks at Armenia under Pashinyan right now, he is not just looking at a diplomatic problem, he is looking at a dangerous example. And Pashinyan makes it worse by refusing to perform the old post-Soviet ritual of pretending that Moscow is always the senior partner, because his government is openly committed to European integration. Armenia may soon move towards visa-free travel to Europe, and even Yerevan is looking to pull out of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, once again pretty much Putin's brainchild, if you want to call it like this, which would eventually raise the question of Russia's military base in Gyumri. For Armenia, this shift is practical, because when Azerbaijan fired at Armenia's internationally recognized territory, Russia did not act like a reliable ally. And whatever flaws NATO may have, the CSTO proved that it could not deliver the basic protection it was supposed to provide. Putin just ignored him. Pashinyan also does not treat Putin and Lukashenko with the careful respect they expect from smaller states, because he has criticized Lukashenko, trolled Putin to his face, and even ridiculed digital censorship during Kremlin talks, which may sound symbolic, but in systems built on hierarchy and personal status, those details matter so much. Then there is the issue that might even irritate Moscow even more. Armenia does not reliably extradite Russian citizens at Moscow's request. And while people may be detained briefly, they are often just released quickly, even quicker, which suggests this is just a deliberate policy rather than just a random local decisions. Since the full-scale invasion began, Armenia had become one of the busiest destinations for the Russian exodus, partially because Russian nationals can enter using domestic passports, and that means mobilization avoiders, service members who walked away, business owners, and even officials heading towards the United States or any other country often pass through Armenia first. So the economic impact has been enormous, with Armenia's GDP rising 13% in 2022, 8% in 2023, and 6% in 2024, outpacing Georgia and other countries that accepted Russian immigrants. And this matters because Armenia became a place where Russian money and human capital could move without being fully controlled by Putin's system. For the Kremlin, that is an insult wrapped inside a strategic problem, because if a new mobilization drive, a confrontation with the Baltic states, or another major escalation begins to loom, Armenia becomes the destination many Russians trust more than Georgia, where entry can be denied, or Kazakhstan, where people fear made-up charges and extradition back to Russia. So when Moscow looks at Pashinyan, it sees not only a prime minister moving towards Europe, but a leader whose country has become a non-extradition safe haven, a political shelter, and a reminder that Russians can sometimes find protection in a former ally that no longer obeys the Kremlin. And once you understand that, Moscow's behavior begins to make a little bit sense. Not because it is clever, but because it is emotional, reactive, and built around one man's refusal to accept that Armenia is not a province with a disobedient governor. Now, as usual, here is the important part of the video. Because the more aggressively Moscow tries to punish Armenia for choosing its own direction, the more it strengthens the exact argument Pashinyan is making to Armenian voters, which is that the country needs more independence, more European integration, and fewer illusions about Russia's reliability. If the Kremlin were actually thinking strategically, it might try to make staying close to Russia attractive through trade benefits, security guarantees, and quiet diplomacy. But instead, it has chosen the path of war. Well, it has chosen blackmail, trade restrictions, and the public elevation of a billionaire challenger whose image is impossible to separate from Moscow's influence. Obviously, that approach might please Putin emotionally, hopefully not physically, and it might make Russian television sound confident for a few weeks, but it is a terrible way to win a competitive election, because when voters already suspect that their sovereignty is under pressure, the worst thing an outside power can do is prove them right in literally real time. This is why the so-called long-term strategy theory does not convince me, because some people might say Russia is preparing the ground for the next election, creating pain now so that 5 years later a loyal government can say, "We warned you." But that assumes a level of planning and local understanding that the Kremlin has not shown in Ukraine, Moldova, Montenegro, or almost any other foreign political adventure or any other foreign intervention, proven or not. If these people were genuinely capable of building a careful 5-year plan that accounts for local society, European support, trade pressure, and Pashinyan's popularity, then many Russians would never have had to learn the names of Malta, Machka in the Zaporozhye region in the first place, or any other small villages that the Kremlin just uses to distract people from other problems. The simpler explanation is that Putin treats Pashinyan like a rogue governor, and everyone around Putin understands that the safest thing to do is to feed that anger, amplify it, and create campaign ideas that sound loyal in Moscow, even if they are destructive in Yerevan. And guess what? When the results arrived and Pashinyan's party already won, the Kremlin did not say, our strategy failed because we insulted voters, damaged trade, and made Armenia feel threatened. Exactly what they did. Because systems like these barely admit the obvious. Instead, they said the West interfered better, like America needs different president for Armenia for somehow. They said that Europe bought the election, or the mysterious puppet masters outplayed Russia again. That is the tragedy of this whole story, because Russia's top politicians never seem to learn from those failed interventions, and instead of understanding that pressure turns neighbors into opponents, they keep doubling down, blackmailing allies, treating nearby countries as territories with temporary flags, and convincing themselves that any leader who refuses Moscow's line must be removed somehow, maybe through a so-called special military operation. Guys, if you want to keep following unusual stories like these, not just frontline updates, and which refinery got struck, hit for the 10th time in the same week or months, please make sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, don't forget about the Patreon, the link is down below. Thanks so much for watching, see you, well, on Monday.